Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Spark Spotlight podcast. I'm your new host, Jack Johnson, and today I'm going to be talking with Paula Payton, a mentor at the I2C. We had a really interesting conversation about Paula's experiences in business, including discussions about bias, behavior studies, and business plan development, so you won't want to miss it. Let's roll. Hi, Paula. How are you doing today?
I'm well, Jack. It's great to see you. Thank you for having me today.
Very happy to have you. Go ahead and start by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about your professional background, where you're coming from.
Absolutely. So my name is Paula Payton. I am, an applied behavioral scientist by training. I started out my career thinking that I wanted to be an academic researcher. And I was very interested in the classic problems of behavioral science, such as, how do you get people to learn and what influences their memory and possibly what biases their decision making. But early in my graduate career, I get very interested in sort of applied problems. I remember walking across the quad over to the business school and really learning about different consumer behavior models and thinking about marketing and advertising and getting very intrigued by those industries. And so I spent initially my career working, I would say, as a researcher and as a strategist, if you will, specifically working at agencies, developing sort of very personalized and regional sort of consumer promotions, and using the levers that I had to sort of understand behavior and get people to do what we were interested in, which was get them to buy more stuff on a more frequent basis. So that's kind of what I worked in. But throughout my career, I've had a number of different roles. I've run research programs at large trade associations. I've worked at a number of different universities and business schools now, teaching courses to help students in sort of experiential learning or in other kinds of, or develop other kinds of capabilities. I've been in startup. I've been a consultant where I've worked closely with entrepreneurs and founders, as well as large corporations who are trying to sort of activate their innovative inner child, if you will, just trying to sort of extend their external innovation in new and different ways. So I have been fortunate enough to sort of work in a number of different ecosystems and environments, and I think that's kind of informed my my thinking. That's just a little bit of my background.
Yeah, I was looking over the page on you from the university that you're teaching at, and the list of places that you've consulted for is very impressive. And just overall, your whole background was really fascinating to me. I love the fact that you bring all of the kind of psychological side of things into your consulting and just your whole perspective on things. My wife is a psychology major, so she's talked to me a lot about, behaviorism and all of that learning. And so I think that's incredibly interesting, and thinking about the ways that intersects with business is just fascinating.
I agree, and thank you. I think it's for many companies, and from startup to sort of established companies, I think they're just starting to think about that tool. Consumer behavior has been pretty well entrenched, but starting to think about how you can use different frameworks to sort of accomplish things from whether it's pitching pitching to an investor that might have a set of biases that you need to at least be cognizant of before you develop that pitch, onto when you have a disruptive innovation that affects, let's say, how you go to market, really how you might even pull some levers of what we know about getting change done at an organizational level. So I think it is something that comes in useful, and I suspect your wife finds it fairly useful in her work and in general too.
Yeah. And so would you say that kind of more psychological approach is a big part of what kind of defines your expertise? How's that kind of changed over the years?
Yeah, I think so I started out as a behavioral scientist, and as I said, I spent a lot of time in sort of marketing. And one of the capabilities that I added on was analytics. And so when you bring those two together, because I think there's very few startups today that don't have some form of data attached to them. There are some, but most of them are sort of piping in new streams of data. When you have data, you need analytics. And so what I found to be a particularly powerful combination is, so behavioral scientist gives you different frameworks and let's say tools to sort of understand things, as I said, from consumers to biases, even, to technology adoption if you're, developing new tech. But analytics obviously is another tool that helps you understand, you can do deep dives and look sort of at scale at sort of what consumers are doing, for example, and then you can figure out, and then you marry sort of behavioral science to that and figure out how to get them to change. So that's when I think you have a really powerful combination. So I think, and this is an interesting challenge for founders, for makers and founders and entrepreneurs, but just sort of finding your corner, right? Really, which is, you and everybody else will have a particular set of skills, but I think it's kind of the intersection where you might bring in sort of two skills like I did, that creates kind of a new opportunities and new spaces that gets really interesting. And that's one of the things that I like to talk about in my courses when I teach.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of our listeners here in Huntsville are going to be really comfortable with that discussion of data and analytics.
Yes.
Just because I think people are even more aware of that stuff here because it's so, technology oriented.
I couldn't agree more. This market really is fantastic when you think of the base of tech, of engineering, of defense, and sort of analytics on top of that. So I think this is really such an interesting and such an advanced community in terms of those areas. So.
Yeah, and I'm sure that with all of the developments with like COVID, technology has become so much more important, and just to, all different kinds of entrepreneurs, all different businesses, and the way that consumers interact with those businesses has become much more focused through computers, through their phones. And so that gives, I think, much more data for people to work with, because then not only do they have information on like what are consumers buying, they can potentially even record information on like what are consumers looking at, like what are they browsing. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of just turns, I've kind of started to think of attention as like the most valuable commodity in today's market. And I think that's very heavily tied to data, the way that businesses are able to like track that.
Jack, you made some really, really great insightful observations there that I'd love to build on a little bit. So I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think, observers of COVID often say that it's sort of crisis-driven innovation, right? A lot of things that were already happening got just accelerated by virtue of that pandemic that affected everybody in so many different ways, right? And some of the interesting things that we see come out of that are just, you saw things come to the forefront, like when we had the need for telemedicine because of social distancing, right? You had platforms that really had to flex to be able to accommodate that. You had AI and machine learning put against systems like supply chains that were trying to make sure that different markets had enough toilet paper and bananas and different things that companies like Walmart or Chiquita worry about. And so I think it was a really interesting inflection point that was sort of that many organizations and people took advantage of. For me, I think it's inspired my thinking because I was delivering a lot of my content, my teaching, my doing my research, obviously through what we're doing now, right? Which is kind of this digital platform in which we engage. But I think I've been thinking a lot, and I know there's been a lot of good people thinking about sort of, what is our next generation of workforce going to need in terms of, tools to help them, whether it's product development or whether it's, meetings, how is it, what are the tools that are going to be needed to sort of accelerate digital transformation post-COVID? And there's a lot of interesting thinking and writing about that right now. So thank you for bringing that up. COVID has certainly been an accelerant for many of us, rocket fuel in many ways.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so kind of building off of that and breaking it down to maybe a more basic level, outside of just the technological front, in your years of experience, what would you say is like the most essential part to any business plan? Not just plans focused on tackling like the pandemic, but just in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see opportunities in two areas. One, I'll circle back somewhat predictably to, my original position of, I think in business plan development, we tend to overlook, due to a cognitive bias, who our consumer is, what our end market is, and it's really easy to do. So let's talk about a consumer bias of overconfidence. So you see that when you have, let's say, a developer or a founder who is projecting from her own set of, well, this is what I would want and this is what I would need, to a population that maybe she's not a part of, right? And so that's a classic error, which is, oh, this is a great thing and I would love it, therefore the market is just going to be naturally built for that, right? And so the gap in there is sort of doing kind of the thoughtful research and then analysis to really understand that consumer, and not just anticipate that there's a market there simply because it seems like there should be, because you think it's a good idea. So that era of overconfidence, I think, is something really to be watchful for, and sometimes affects the integrity of the business plan that's developed. So more time up front, really understanding that consumer. And then second, related to that, is this idea of a real appetite and a real capability around piloting, testing, experimenting. It's not just simply failing fast and failing cheap. It's kind of like really, because there is a rigor to sort of doing good experimentation, right? Developing good proof of concepts before launches, piloting, testing, being a good experimentalist. That I think sometimes when you look at business plans that are maybe fail or maybe are doomed to failure, it may be because there wasn't enough time or runway or resources put against that really valuable piece. So those are some of the two areas that I think really are important to get right. That are very, people hop over them, or as I said, they're sort of subject to biases. They think, oh well, I don't really have to do any research because you just know that the market is really going to be interested in that particular thing that I think is interesting, because I've done all the needs assessment purely. Well, not purely, but I've been biased by my own assessment. So those are a couple of areas.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And you can definitely see a lot of the kind of psychological, analytical approach in that perspective on things. It's very interesting to consider the ways in which our own biases can interfere with, the plans that we maybe think should work out.
Yes. Yes, and it doesn't matter how smart you are. It doesn't matter how many degrees you have. The brain is just magnificently hardwired, right, to have biases, because on a good day, biases work really, really well for us, right? They enable us to get a lot of things done and focus on certain things and not on other things. And generally speaking, that's a good thing. It's simply when you may let that get a little bit away from yourself, right? And you're not sort of double checking to make sure that it's bias free. But the other thing, really, can we all be good and better experimentalists? That is a problem that even large corporations that struggle with innovation don't get right a lot of the time. And there's been a lot of good writing and thinking around this idea, which is being an experimentalist. Really, that is a classic approach that again, academic researchers have. They're trained many years to sort of apply a lot of those frameworks and theories to develop sort of good science that is meaningful and valid, right? Valid and reliable. In a corporate environment or even a startup environment, you're working with limited resources, you're working against the clock, you're really just trying to do your proof of concept in a certain way, so you can do a launch, or you can make sure that it's good enough. You often don't have the luxury to sort of do repeated testing or to sort of tweak things experimentally, so you exactly know what's driving one thing or another. And I'm not suggesting that's that you completely need to import those models. It's a little bit of a balance, but becoming a good experimentalist. There's some work that's been done. Sort of, should we have chief experimental officers? Heading up organizations that do nothing but help organizations, small or large, just think in a more scientific way about what should be working or not. It's an interesting thing to think about.
Yep. How exactly to target their market.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so clearly you've had a lot of experience working with different companies and consulting with them and just different entrepreneurs in general. But was there ever like a specific entrepreneurial journey that you've been a part of that involved like a huge challenge to the entrepreneur that they had to overcome? And like, what are those experiences like?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give one example. When I was working in a startup in Boston, that was a sports analytics startup, and we ran into some real challenges, both with the investor community, who had certain predispositions, not about our value proposition, but as well about the founders, and let me talk about that in turn. So, what we did at this company, it was called Smart Sports, and what we decided to do was we installed technology inside of batting cages, because our first launch was with baseball. And what we decided to do was because we felt the data would be cleaner, we didn't put technology on the sports equipment or on the athlete. That is to say, we didn't put it on a bat or a mitt or a glove, rather, or on the athlete herself or himself. We instead put it on in the environment. But when we would present to the to the investor community, at that point, wearables were taking off very fast and furiously, and it was very hard for us to back them down and sort of say, you see, the data from an environment like that, the data will actually not have a lot of noise in it. Will be will be more predictive. But it was very hard to get that. Again, we didn't have a wearable at that point, and so whenever we would present or go for a raise in front of the investor community, we couldn't back them down for that bias, because they wanted to see a wearable. And even though we could sort of demonstrate that the data that a wearable would sort of deliver wasn't anything close to what our batting cages could deliver with that. So that was an interesting battle, because we were not able to prevail and sort of move on to sort of the next raise, because we just couldn't get around that. So the second issue was kind of as the investors were sort of looking at us, I realized also that they had stereotypes of what they think entrepreneurs, certainly in sports, should be and should look like. And so those stereotypes are very interesting, because it can influence their decision. So we were one of the founders was a female, one was a male, but I felt very strongly that we didn't necessarily come from the sport. We did have a founder that came from the sport, but the female founder did not come from the sport, and she was a female founder working in analytics, and that looked different and unusual to some of the investor community at that time. And so again, it was complex for them to see a non-athlete female trying to do a raise for a sports analytics company, even though it was. In a way, being a non-athlete makes you perfectly objective in terms of the data. You're not so passionate about the sport that you can't you can't make objective decisions about what happens. So that was interesting. So we had we had two examples of, and you could say there were biases or stereotypes that was sort of surprising. But I can tell you the story of that. We developed. we're doing something I think that was really ahead of its time, because we could actually develop 100 different metrics off of our smart cage is what we called it, and we could roll those up into one number that we called a physical SAT that could be used in scouting or in coaching. And I'll tell you the last piece of that, which was we couldn't always eliminate the stereotyping, the biases in those particular examples, but where we did make a difference was with an audience and a community that we thought would be the hardest to actually move forward, and that was the scouts, because we thought our technology would actually displace what they did. Because if you're scouting for talent, and you're going, you are sending your best scouts who are used to visually sort of assessing future athletic performance based on what they see on the field, right? And so when you produce sort of a new technology and a new number, that could feel very displacing. But ultimately, as we explained what the technology was designed to do, which was it would surface the top 5% of what would be valuable to them, and then they could actually deploy what they did best, which was those years of judgment and decision making against that 5%. What we saved them from doing was going through 100%, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that was really, and once they understood that basically we were sort of getting rid of that, or just again giving them the top 1% to 5% of what
eliminating
they were looking for. Yeah, it was very efficient, and they loved it. They understand, and they were many of the scouts didn't cut their teeth in tech environments, and so to see that they were very eager to sort of use this technology was very gratifying. So that's an example in which we could move the needle a little bit on an existing stereotype, which was sort of anti-tech. So that's a recent example of where I was working in a startup environment and really trying to sort of change how people thought about using the product and how it might change their work going forward. So.
Yeah, that's really really interesting.
Yeah.
And going back to a couple of the points that you made, first thing that just I guess kind of stood out to me the most was you were talking about the different stereotypes that are kind of at play in that investor entrepreneur interaction, and I was just kind of wondering, I've got a very slight background in some data analytics, mm-hmm. and I was wondering what you would say, how important you would say it is for entrepreneurs to have an understanding of like heuristics and like shortcuts that people naturally take to try to understand the world better and the consequences of those heuristics.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important, and in the course that I teach at a business school right now, we very specifically look at how biases, particularly in AI, can have ethical ramifications, and how if you are running a company or expect to be running a company that utilizes AI in any way, AI or machine learning in any way, then you have to understand how this can creep in, and there can be bias in the data that's fed into the model. There could be bias in the training that's performed on the model. There could be bias in the interpretation on the back end, and I think it's just something to be mindful of. And so I spend a lot of time talking to my B school students about really how to spot it, how to just be aware of it. And part of their leadership journey is to just know that it can be built into all levels of the process. And the only way to avoid it is just to, stop, look, and listen, and understand that it's always underlying. So there's things that you can do at all three stages of that process to mitigate the effects of bias on sort of, the analysis that comes out of whatever you're doing. But I think it's really critical, right? So that's one example. And then just we've talked a lot about bias in this call, and it is something that's surfacing right now in a lot of different areas. And so the good news is, I think there's, as we stay mindful that it may be continuously operating, and then we look at ways that we can unpack it from, the work that we do, the analyses that we conduct, the courses that we teach, the things that we learn, we'll be able to move forward, thoughtfully and debias ourselves. So
yeah. I think that point about machine learning is especially interesting because I think that oftentimes people have this expectation that because it's based in a computer that it's going to be unbiased. And so, as that's developed and we've realized that computers are in fact very biased, I think that that's something that really does require a lot of attention in this market because it's becoming increasingly more and more important.
There's an example that let me just bring up because you just reminded me of something, Jack. Thank you. I mentioned that I've done a little bit of done actually some research in voice tech. It was an area of keen interest of mine recently. Now I'm working with something called the Open Voice Network, which I can talk about a little bit. But I did a lot of research in voice, and as I was doing it, I was primarily looking at voice assistants to understand whether they would change consumers' behaviors. And I was specifically looking at e-commerce, but obviously with voice being embedded in everything, I think Ford and Amazon just made an announcement today that voice would be embedded in 700,000 new Ford vehicles coming up. So, but one of the things that I found early on was in when the developers were sort of building out some of the voice recognition in one of the devices. I don't really go into what it was. They forgot to code. They forgot to put in some classic language, and so for an example of that is. And it was discovered much later by researchers that were doing the study. So what the researchers did and found that I thought was really interesting was they discovered that when a woman said something to her voice assistant, such as "I'm in the process of getting hurt," hurt in a particular way, it was actually "I need help. I'm getting hurt." That and it wasn't hurt. It was raped. Getting raped. That the developers had not coded that into the voice protocol, and the voice assistant didn't understand that language. And when the researchers went back and found that, they discovered that the developers, all of whom were male at that point, hadn't put in any, had not trained the voice assistant yet on. Number one, issues like that, where there would be a crisis and specific issues that were relevant to many women, and so that was a study that came out just a few years ago, and so you began to see this connection of could people who were in the process of getting harmed, men, women, children, begin to have conversations with their voice assistant that shared things that were happening, or perhaps mental health states, and what would be the responsibility, or what should developers think about, or how should they think about sort of helping the assistant do some of that recognition. So, I mean, I think that was a really startling example of the voice assistant didn't know what that word meant because the developers hadn't put it in there. And so, I think we'll see more examples like that. And it's transitioned me to thinking about mental health, right, as mental health tech, and how can assistants perhaps understand if somebody is suffering from anxiety or depression from, you can do vocal tract analysis. When we pause more, sometimes that can demonstrate stress to, talking to a chatbot or a voice assistant saying, I need information on antidepressants, or I need information on therapists in my area, or just those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So I think, that was a long-winded answer of sort of saying, I think there are so many opportunities right now for tech and for tech entrepreneurs that want to get into this space to figure out, how to support people in a variety of ways, not the least of which is mental health tech and just wellness tech, I guess.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Honestly, that's not something I'd ever considered about, computers analyzing the specific way that we're saying things to them outside of, oh, I've got to pronounce this word very particularly for my phone to understand or something. That's really interesting to think about, different ethical concerns there.
Yes.
And one thing that can really get into that's fascinating is the idea of responsibility and what responsibilities do the developers themselves have. Because with any of those things, especially with mental health, any computer scientists aren't exactly trained necessarily to handle that.
And nor should they. Should they be? I think it's a really nascent area right now, and I think hopefully it's causing is a lot of important dialogue between various stakeholders and constituents who can begin to address those issues. I think one of the things we learned from COVID certainly was as telemedicine lurched forward, right? Because it had to be. I think what I read and understood was many clinicians, many practitioners were very and patients too were. I won't say delighted, but really satisfied with what telemedicine was able to do. And I think now, there have been some recent launches about. There was one particular in New York called. What's it called yet? I'll have to think of the name of it. But a woman at Columbia has just launched. Has just done a raise, and she Get Real. That's what it is. Okay. And what she's doing is she's recognizing a shortfall in the market, the fact that there are not enough therapists in the market, and so she's developed a platform that is specifically doing delivering online therapy to sort of combat depression, anxiety, because there is a shortage of providers, and certainly with COVID, the opportunity to sort of use a platform to sort of reach out if you were feeling stressed or feeling anxious, as so many of us were during that difficult time, I think was very powerful. And I think we'll start to see more launches like that, where it's this perfect storm of how can we use tech and how can we use it to solve sort of those social problems that social and psychological problems that people feel. How can it begin to connect us? How can it we all want to launch, unicorns and have that, but also having that circular economy, which is you sort of are developing a product or service that also does good as well as sort of is profitable is kind of the perfect storm, right? How can we begin to do that? So I think it's a really interesting opportunity going forward.
Yeah, certainly. So as a mentor who's worked with a lot of different entrepreneurs, what would you consider to be the biggest kind of single weakness that many entrepreneurs have? How does that really affect them and their business?
Well, we talked earlier about one, which is sometimes overconfidence, right? Which is interesting to talk about, because you always think about entrepreneurs will suffer from underconfidence, but sometimes overconfidence can be very deadly, because sometimes you just hit a stream of luck, and you can feel as if that can enable you to feel overconfident, and that can enable you to make some classic errors. So there's that. But the one I wanted to talk about, because I was thinking about this, there's a whole. If we stick on the bias stream, there's a whole bunch of biases that I think entrepreneurs and founders are specifically susceptible to. But I want to talk about leadership for a minute, because I think leadership development is something that founders and entrepreneurs classically overlook, and I think it's so important. And again, one of the courses I teach is around leadership. And so leadership development. So oftentimes what happens is, leadership capital, right? The human capital that the founders bring to the equation is critical, and that's sometimes what the investors are really looking hard at. But if you can imagine, many early stage and young companies really have a bunch of young or I should say inexperienced people that are perhaps very adept in certain areas, right? They could be tech whizzes or they could be analytics whizzes, but they're not experienced and they're not developed leaders because they just haven't had the time to sort of develop. They're not used to structured routines. And so one of the things I think about and I talk a lot about is I wonder if there was more focus on leadership early on in that entrepreneur's journey, whether the failure rate would be less, whether you could mitigate it. And I think the answer to that is yes, because I think sometimes founders, they're so busy, they don't have time to sort of do their own leadership development. They have mentors that are counseling them on, raising capital or sort of, minimum viable product or sort of all of those important pieces of building the business. But in terms of developing themselves as leaders and leaders of organizations, I think sometimes that is classically overlooked. And I feel as if that was sort of embedded, and that's why, having organizations like I2C at UAH, which is really, a great incubator that is connected to, a great business school that has a lot of experts in management and in leadership and in development, is a huge resource, right? For founders and makers. I think that's terrific. One of my favorite companies right now, they're called Torch, and they're headquartered in San Francisco, and they do leadership coaching and training. But early on, they walked the walk and they talked the talk, which is they started a company that was on workplace coaching and leadership development, and from the beginning, both founders have been focused on leadership development and training for themselves, and much earlier than you might imagine. They're quite good leaders, not just quite good entrepreneurs. As they're about $100 million company now, very young, but they're really focused on leadership development. So that's an area which surprisingly I think can be overlooked.
Yeah. So you as a professor, you feel that that's something that can really be built up starting in college, even earlier?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think experiential learning, courses that have that built in, where you are either getting to hear directly from people in the field or in industries that you want to enter, or just experiential learning opportunities or courses like capstones or practicums, where you really get a chance to perhaps lead a team of other students, and you have to solve a problem, or you have to run a hack, and you're in charge of the team. I think all of those are really important, and I'm very gratified when I see universities kind of sprinkling those in early on. You can imagine almost every course could have an experiential learning element to it, even if it's as simple as I always bring in a ton of guest lecturers to my courses, and they give
Right.
fireside chats, right? And then the students have a chance to sort of ask them questions like, how did you, or what would you do differently, or what advice can you give? And even if they get a chance to do that for 45 minutes. Most of those professionals will link in later on and serve as informal mentors down the road. So I really think that is critical. But the entrepreneurs also have to see it. Sometimes they don't necessarily think about their own leadership. They're not focused on that. So I think part of what we can do, whether it's as mentors or as hosts like incubators, I2C, or even as universities, is impress upon them that may be the key variable that drives failure in entrepreneurial launches, is overlooking the leadership development of the founder. And what if you could kind of cure that and scaffold it early on? Then because success in that entrepreneurial venture is not simply about finding funding and putting together a capable team. It's about building the leader and helping the leadership development of all the core members of that team. So don't wait until you're established or doing your third round. Do it early on and be committed to it, and be the best leader that you can.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I definitely agree with a lot of what you said. My whole job here at ITC is very much because of programs like that. Started out as a practicum for me, and I can definitely tell that a lot of what I've learned through here stuff that I can literally use at any job for the rest of my life. It's very, very helpful, and I can definitely see how, that like learning about leadership early on is critical to just take your approach to how do you tackle any problem, whether you're working alone or with a team. Because I think if you're not able to step up and take on that kind of leadership role, then even if a lot of people associate being a leader with having a team, but you also got to be a good leader just for yourself, because you can kind of have different parts of your brain that are wanting to go off in different directions. Unless you can organize yourself to get that, overcome a challenge to get a task done, then you're still gonna struggle with it, even if it's just you.
I think that's a really good point. And just to circle back on that, I am so glad that you have had and are having experiences that help grow you, because leadership is it is about it's about having a vision. It's about really being able to accomplish objectives, and those are all core components of being a good leader. And you're absolutely right. You don't need people reporting into you to be a leader. You can sort of lead yourself, because we all have different components. There's you as a student, there's you as a podcaster, there's you as a contributor to society. I mean, there's sort of, you have lots of different sides of you, and you have to sort of lead yourself forward. The other thing I just want to close on about leadership, because it's not just about, as I said, deciding to be a good leader. There are so many tools, assessments. It's about understanding that leadership journey is a journey you take your entire life, and you find your leadership style, and there are so many different assessments and different valuable tools out there that can help leaders. Leaders can't grow by themselves. They need to grow by understanding what their vulnerabilities are, what their challenges are, and then continuously evaluating them, and then using mentors to specifically grow. That's what good leaders do, and that's who good leaders are.
It's very much about, I think, recognizing who you can talk to, which connections you can make to learn more and grow as a person and as an entrepreneur.
Yes.
And so, entrepreneurs that are maybe looking to tackle a new market or to put out a new product, and they're trying to create business models around these things, what do you think the most important part of the process is when you're translating these consumer pain points into a business model?
Yeah, and I'll circle back to some of the ideas that I made earlier, and then I'll build on them. Number one, it's just sort of thinking you've done the work, that you really understand what the consumer pain points when you might not have, because pain points can be complex. For example, we know that one of the reasons that voice assistants have really begun to take off is because they're convenient. Well, what does convenient mean? Convenient means something different to me than it might mean to you, right? But oftentimes, I think sometimes that the tendency is to sort of say, oh, well, we did a few focus groups, and consumers said they wanted a more convenient shopping experience. Okay, so we're going to go with that. But I think really drilling down and unpacking, what does that mean? Does convenient mean, you get 2 more hours back? Does convenient mean you can do it while you do something else, like holding a baby? You can shout out your order to your voice assistant and say, send me more, paper towels. I mean, what exactly is the essence of convenience for that? Because I think the better that future entrepreneurs are at that, the more precise their MVP will be. They won't necessarily say, well, I think convenience is about that, and so I'm going to build a product that sort of addresses that. And further down the road, they find out that they might have missed the mark a little bit. So I think, taking being thoughtful, working with people that really have some expertise and understanding how to unpack those kinds of pain points is really critical. Being passionate about it, not just saying, all right, I'm going to do this, then I want to get on to the more interesting part, which is maybe the product design for you, or sort of the launch, but really sort of taking special. Well, I won't say joy, but there's a special gratification, I think, in really understanding fully and completely like what that pain point is. So you can say, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. So here's an example. I'm working on a project right now with a large tech company, and they have recently had to shutter a lot of their physical locations. And that's been really hard for their entire team, their customer-facing team. And so they're having to do some reevaluation of how they used to really get consumers to learn about some of their new products. They're at a bit of a disadvantage. And that often happens to companies that have really cut their teeth in a certain way. So, for example, if you are really good at retail stores, you use the power of that store environment. Because what consumers have done for years and years and years is we used to look at advertising to learn about things, right? That's how we learned about TVs. We started to read about TVs in newspaper ads, and then we got interested, and then we would go into, this was many years ago when TVs were launched, right? Then we go into stores and we would look at TVs, and we would sort of walk around them, and we would pick them up, and we would sort of interact with them, and then then we would bring them into our homes. And so that whole process of learning through an ad or a newspaper, or now Google, right, that discovery, and then sort of going into a physical environment and looking at stuff, and then maybe you go and you do a little bit more research, and then you may go back and purchase the item inside of the store. You may just say, oh, I'm just going to get it online. But all of that whole consumer discovery process, has been disrupted, both in terms of COVID, but also just sometimes, I think certainly with the growth of different marketplace providers like Amazon, where Amazon started training people to not even just, to go onto Amazon and just search for things, to learn about things, and buy them from there. So a lot of companies that were used to thinking about consumer pain points in a certain way have had to totally transform their thinking, right? And think in new and different ways about, well, how am I going to, if I sell phones, how am I going to get you interested in my phone when I really want you to know how light it is? It's so light, you're going to be able to wear it in your front pocket or in your back pocket without it falling out of your front pocket or your shirt pocket. Like, how am I going to be able to convey that? And so sometimes the answer to that is text. Sometimes maybe it's AR, VR. Maybe it's kind of, those kinds of platform capabilities are coming forward. But maybe it's really about drilling down into that pain point where I can just have a dialogue with you and understand. It's really not having a lightweight device that's interesting to you. The real pain point for you is not that it's too heavy. The real pain point for you is that it falls out of your pants, right? Your pockets, or something like that. So that's a slightly different pain point, right? Of course, I'm just completely making this up, right? So then I might design something in the use factor, right, that sort of just stays in your pocket, something that's light and stays in your pocket, or something that, so it doesn't have to be quite as heavy. So I think there's really interesting ways in which you can understand pain points, translate them into product design. Overcome limitations when we don't have store environments where people can, lift things up or do different kinds of things. So, and I think as it's just up to us to sort of be thoughtful and creative and clever in terms of how we extract those insights going forward.
Yeah, I know that's definitely very interesting. I feel like with examples like that, like by now Zoom is always the best one to go with, just because it's such a ubiquitous experience. So I'm trying to think of some way that you could tie that back to like Zoom in the way that, because clearly, I mean, there are a lot of different products on the market that do what Zoom does, but there's some reason why Zoom is the one that kind of swooped in and took over the whole market almost overnight.
Yeah.
And, they've still been able to maintain, sure, very good business despite the fact that, their primary business model, which was have, like 45-minute meetings, and then you could upgrade to like a premium plan, and then you could have meetings for as long as you want. And it totally scrapped that model and moved over to this, like, now everybody can have meetings for as long as they want. That's just what I've been thinking about a lot recently, and, trying to figure out where is that going to, where does that start to become profitable for them? So that would be almost like Netflix saying, now you can watch everything you want to watch without even having to pay that subscription fee.
Well, I think part of it is an adoption. I mean, I don't know the entire Zoom story, but I think they had first mover advantage. I mean, I think honestly, they had such penetration with universities, certainly. And I think from there, it was sort of like a common language. But I don't necessarily think the platform is the best one that's out there. I think it's fraught with issues. But they just they just had great penetration, and so I think what would happen is people then started to look at, when you're used by universities, you are affecting millions of people. So many of my students now, are working professionals that are getting their degrees, right? So they could, it may be that they imported good experiences in, from their educational setting. Maybe it was just a, it's certainly hard to say. In terms of the model, I tend to think that it's, it has to do with just getting some cadence with their adoption. I think they found that they were frustrating people with that 45-minute cutoff because there are very few interactions. I think when people were started to using them for community events or yoga classes or whatever purposes Zoom was used for the free subscribers, that the 45-minute cutoff was just really creating a massive pain point, and so they were far better off, right? Sort of creating these boundless meeting opportunities, and over time I think they'll probably pull that back, and all of a sudden then people will have committed their entire whatever non-profit organization to Zoom, so they'll be willing to sort of pay a small fee to sort of continue using the platform. So I mean, if I had to speculate, that would certainly be my guess. But getting the widespread adoption and getting people fluent in Zoom, because there was a while where you if you were a Zoom ninja, you were inevitably called to sort of walk somebody through it, like your aunt or your mother or something like that, right? And so you would sort of walk them through it. Now they're reasonably proficient. They know how to do it. So you have church groups and you have yoga groups, and they're all now using Zoom at a pretty reasonable level. So I mean, I think just as that swell continues, they'll just continue to have that massive penetration.
Yeah. I don't know. It's always just been something that fascinates me, because having grown up when I did, like, always had friends all over the world and interacted with them using software like Zoom, but never Zoom itself. And so I was kind of taken aback when I was like, oh, there's this new program that people are using instead of the one that like me and my friends have been using for, years.
It's interesting how that works, right? So interesting.
Yeah. And so finally, just as a mentor, how have you helped entrepreneurs across multiple industries? And then kind of finish things up by, if you had to distill everything that you've learned down into, kind of a single piece of advice for entrepreneurs, what would that be?
So in terms of the first question, I mean, I think I would have to say through teaching and judging. I mean, at NYU, when I had oversight over a master's in marketing, the capstone course was really about supporting future entrepreneurs, and so organizing that course, making sure that there were judges at the end of the course to sort of evaluate the launches. Was a special joy of mine, right? And I also got to judge from time to time. We ran hundreds of students through those capstone courses. So that was certainly at NYU that I have done that. And then in my teaching role at Columbia, that capstone typically is more focused around analytics, but about half of those have to do with launches that involve data, and so teaching students again through the structure of a course, but just within the confines of that course, you're really, developing that launch, or developing the business plan or doing the consumer research. It's just the course is essentially a shell, and so getting better and better at sort of designing the curriculum so that it really supports students and it gives them the right resources, gives them access to lots and lots of industry professionals, and is primarily the way that I've done it. And that's where I'm mostly comfortable, because I think it's I like the structure of having the course, their final course as a graduate student, to sort of kind of set them on their way. But I look forward to my future involvement in I2C as a mentor. I look forward to helping in a variety of ways, not the least of which was boost judging just in April, which was a lot of fun. I was so impressed with so much of the talent that came by. Now, turning to your second question, which is inevitably hard, I'm always loath to sort of distill wisdom down into one silver bullet to sort of sort of send out, because I think even in an sorry, I couldn't hear what you said. speaks the voice assistant. It's interesting, but I think so. My final bit of advice, if you're asking me for one silver bullet, I'm going to advise future entrepreneurs to be wary of any single silver bullet advice. So I'm going to offer the counter advice, because life and business is complex, and anything that can be summed up in sort of a pithy expression probably belongs on a Hallmark or American greetings card, not necessarily used to sort of found a venture and move it forward through different stages. I think it's everybody's journey and pathway is going to be different. There are many tools out there, not the least of which is I2C and others, to certainly take advantage of them. We've talked a lot about different things, different recommendations here, from leadership development to recognizing biases that I think are important. Do all of them, and the future will be yours.
All right, that was a fantastic answer, and I'd say that's a great piece of advice. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for being willing to hop on a Zoom call and have this chat, and it's been really fruitful, I think. A lot of really interesting topics that we've been able to go over. I know I've learned a lot. We're really happy to have you as a mentor with the I2C. Excited to see kind of what the future holds. And yeah, thank you very much.
Jack, it's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed myself too, and I too have learned from you. You really offered some really insightful observations and comments, so it's really been an all-around pleasure. I can't imagine a better way to spend an hour, lunchtime hour, just having a good exchange with a thoughtful podcaster. So best of wishes to you. I look forward to helping in any way, and very excited to get started with my mentoring at I2C. So all the best. Have a great summer and stay well. Thank you again.
Thanks.
Big thanks to Paula for coming on the podcast today and for an excellent conversation. We're really excited to have her here at the I2C as a mentor. She's clearly very intelligent and fantastic at what she does. I hope that you've all enjoyed listening today and that you'll be on the lookout for the next guest on the Spark Spotlight podcast. In the meantime, be sure to follow us on all of our socials, at UAH I2C on Instagram and Twitter, and UAH Invention to Innovation Center on Facebook. Onward and upward.